Good day everyone, I'll be presenting the paper Exploring the Evolution of the Digital Future and its Impact on Mosque Architecture. Myself, Hidayati Ramdi, and my co-writers, Alma Akiami, Fadu Hisham and Siti Balkish. Okay, the paper started with a curiosity in the subject of futurism concerning the changing social landscape and its effects on the community. We tried to imagine the implication of all of these technological changes towards mosque design as architecture. Scholars have often debated and challenged the validity of Islamic architecture concerning mosques, as is often seen as having been borrowed and then expanded language of other architectural civilizations. So then we got to really thinking, and how does the dawning of digital evolution would potentially deconstruct this Islamic sacred architecture as technology evolves, people's livelihood and sacred spaces gets reinterpreted. The study investigates the evolution of digitality through various works of literature and its impact on spirituality and religiosity, and eventually the mosque as sacred space. It tries to speculate on the evolution of mosque architecture in a projected future. Okay, society is increasingly digitized and connected, with computers and algorithms mediating much of daily activity in one way or another. So the evolution is that from our culture fancy, we always imagine living among robots, which is actually the next step of evolution, because we are actually already immersed in technology, becoming digital nations as I speak, as what we are doing now, presenting virtually, where future theorists imagine our consciousness being downloaded onto a computer, replacing being with digitalism and body as mere vessels. So obviously theorists have expanded it so far, choosing mind uploads, having the flesh as digital parts, which is transhumanism technology. However, digitality complicates our gathered knowledge over the phenomenological understanding and its subjective contextualized lenses, because digitalism reconstructs our understanding of embodied knowledge as it often experienced through the interface between digitality and physical. And in this context, the paper talks about digitality in reference to the internet and its processes that rewires our brain significantly, which is actually ubiquitous tool in our everyday lives. Then we query about the evolution of our spiritual experience in digital era, and then how that subsequently impacts mosque architecture. Researchers believe that religious spaces often tend to evoke psycho and thus spiritual responses. So seeing how these two subjects interrelate and potentially collide in the future, it is thus imperative to understand the development of spirituality in the digital age, since digitality is a prevalent experience in our human lives. The paper was done through qualitative research by gathering various works of literature and structured first through a deep curiosity on emerging technologies impacting the trend of life and the spirituality, and then further query on how this development will affect Muslim way of life and the subsequent architectural modifications to religious spaces. The work selected were from technical research literature that contextualizes the trends and investigate future implications towards mosque architecture 40 years from now. So the 40-year projection is a time estimation made in relation to the internet age and the probability of its potential development from the future. And we looked at the evolving environment of digital age, contemporary spirituality and religiosity within the current developments, and then it will then progress to address the possible development as a result of all of this advances. So the first literature review that we looked at was spirituality in the digital age. the internet demands more sociological attention because the sheer amount of time we spend on it, and it's safe to say that we spend a lot of time on the internet, and this actually subtly restructures our thinking pattern, our behaviors, and response and reaction towards others. Furthermore, it decreases the likelihood of being religiously affiliated, and then it actually strengthens individualism. This is because religiosity has been a fixed transference of experience, possibly from an individual, from a religious figure. But now, because it's exposed to the internet by its use, it now expands towards more dynamic, inclusive, and transient spiritual experience, as it provides data on multiple relational perceptions of spirituality and even consciousness. The impact shows a more plural and inclusive consciousness, but it actually complicates metaphors of space and place, including the belief that audiences are separate from each other. So then we looked at how this happened. So we explored digital age and Muslim religiosity in cyberspace. Because of the high volume of Islamic related content and too much, and we needed to limit the findings on the usage of internet medium on the podcast, YouTube, and virtual reality. So the Muslim presence we looked at first in YouTube. The internet has become a significant platform of communication for modern Muslims as an authoritative source for their perceptions, beliefs, and social networking. One of the ones that we looked at was the phenomenological knowledge through embodied experience is disconstructed through the medium of such like YouTube, through the khutbah or the Islamic sermon, because there is an absence of presence. However, it replicates a different and wider emotional pathways. What that means is that when we go to the mosque and we hear a sermon, through the presence we can actually have an emotional experience through hearing the speech. But when we look at it through YouTube or a video, we still have this transference of the emotion can be evoked, but it's just transferred differently. Cyberspace is used as a medium to deconstruct religious authority in the Islamic context, as it's an alternative online discourse that potentially challenge an already established authority in the real world, granting the possible mirrored representation, because there's so much that we can actually get online. So then we looked at the medium of podcast, and it's usually used for da'wah purposes, which is a propagation of Islamic teaching or a self-identification tool. Because of the possibility of Web 2.0, the consumer are now the prosumer, which actually gives access to the active contributor to any discourse in this paper pertaining to religion. At such an accessible speed, it actually breaks the linear participation of religiosity in the real world, which further challenges the mold of established religious authority, because we don't actually know who we're listening to, but if it resonates, we tune in. So due to the fluidity and perceivability of virality, the internet is a system which permits renegotiation, redefinition, and possibly reinvention of Islamic religious authority. And then we also looked at virtual reality. So Muslims began to know the importance of technology, and they adapted to this, which introduces numerous websites dedicated to Islamic education and learning. For example, religious spaces recognized as virtual mosques through like islamonline.com, and virtual reality is embraced to immerse participants in experiencing Islamic rituals like Sa'i without actually going to Mecca, where they actually just experience it through the virtual reality. And then there's also like applications like Collab Deen for Muslim community to connect and interact with smart mosques that allows its members to control and manage aspects of smart mosques like memberships, etc. So in summary, technological advancements have deeply impacted Muslim religious experience that is actually unprecedented ways that permits this research paper to theoretically speculate on the evolution of mosque architecture in the future. To do that, we first looked at Muslims and the digital mosque. Okay, technological advancement today relating to the physical spaces of mosques are used to visualize mosque architecture using virtual reality, for instance, modeling of the Prophet Mosque, mosque conservation visualization, and also convergent mosque, which is a paper, a thesis research done by India, who proposes convergent mosque, that is an exploration of the digital mosque, a new paradigm in mosque design. He reimagines the possibility of a completely new design that will fit the digital age. So why was this and is possible? Because cyberspace creates a new form of telepresence as a real-time telecommunication happens at live speed. As I'm speaking now, we are in a virtual conference, right? So we can virtually be at any place at any time, simultaneously rewiring our phenomenological knowledge, therefore reshape our perception of our built environments. The virtual mosque is a domain in which participants congregate to pray in a space even when they are physically apart but are experiencing each other in virtual presence. So how did he propose this? So he actually established between what can be done physically and what can be done or performed virtually. So azan, which is the call of prayer, in a physical is a minaret, and performed virtually is an online azan application, and the ablution, which is the cleaning of body parts. In physicality, there's a fountain for us to do the sacred ritual, but virtually is actually we can learn about the spiritual or the ritual, and khutbah is provided on screen in virtual required equipment for the projection in performed physically, but virtually is a portal for listening and watching previous and further teachings. And praying, obviously, in physicality, there's an offering of the space to do so, where virtually it's actually a portal where people can actually congregate to do their prayers online. Learning is provide for imam consultation, and then perform virtually is an online education portal. So there's an established between the physical and the virtual. So in summary, literature shows that physical and virtual built environment are experienced in a similar manner. Nevertheless, expectations are different through scale, distance, and other critical variable relevant to architectural experience that do not seem to vary actually that substantially between the built and the corresponding virtual environment. Similarities are more pronounced when technology are more advanced, where virtual settings are of higher fidelity, which allows for a high degree of interaction, multi-sensoriality, and presence of feelings. Even fairly simplistic virtual environments may elicit complex logical responses because we view everything from our mind. In reality, using immersive technologies, for example, head-mounted displays and high-fidelity interactive model that integrate some degree of multi-sensoriality, sound would allow a more precise comparison of virtual and built environment. So it's basically like a video game, but then the virtual is actually mosque attendantship. So in short, the experience of virtual environment elicits the same spiritual feeling psychologically as the real thing. And this is where it's interesting. Thus, it does allow futuristic vision that through technological advancement, the reality and virtual may merge completely. The paper began to speculate and theorize through discussion that it postulates the evolution of mosque architecture through the prism of urgent technological advancement that are already rewiring our phenomenological knowledge and understanding of spiritual and religious experiences. It improves on Imdad's 2016 thesis and proposes 3 types of mosque typology in the future. So the first one is a virtual mosque, which is accessible through virtual reality, which is immersion, the interaction of prayer in one virtual space. It's a 360-degree VR film that previews in a mosque, allows viewers to experience being inside the mosque, but and they are part of the congregation. And then there's the semi-virtual mosque and mosque typology with virtual support, and then typical mosque. The future mosque integrates virtual and physical space. So below is the image of our proposal. So the interior design of this mosque relies on its speakers driven at the focal point of the mosque, as participant setting zones are radially structured around it. Hologram and virtual guide makes like a planetarium ambience like space at the main mosque corridor that would be designed as a building itself that enjoins the ritual and religious exhortation of the sublime, and encourages individual experience in a communal presence as part of the whole, but through the prism of the mind. So the virtual experience virtually is the individual, the presence is the space or domain, which is the collective. So it's actually structured like a journey through an immersive experience from auditorial to sensorial and perceptions of virtuality. These stimulants are perceived through the mind, and that impact the fundamental essence of devotion of an individual and thus the congregation, because everything is experienced through the psyche. So we try to understand that from the evolution of the mosque itself, and if this is actually possible. So we looked at the history of the mosque itself, and many scholars advocate the real function of mosque is actually a community center for Muslim. It is not solely a house of worship, but also functions as a community center for both Muslim and non-Muslim alike. And this is actually precedent from the first mosque, which is the Prophet Muhammad residence. So Islamic Umayyad Empire had actually established a separate role of ruler and the role of the ulama as Islam empire progressed, and this created the divide and separation of administrative building and a place of worship between the secular space and the sacred space, which is the mosque, would eventually become a model of what a contemporary mosque typology is like today, which is a singular purpose place of worship. Ultimately, mosques developed into a monumental symbolic representation of the state. So the more luxurious the state, the bigger the population, and thus the more exuberant the mosque would become as a political statement. So then mosques become a symbol of unity or achievement and pride, and often taken as a historical precedence in spatial melancholia. So essentially, it contrasts greatly, right? So the true definition of a mosque is, however, is not about actually its physical form, rather the prostration act of prayer that can happen anywhere provided the space is clean. The physical form of a mosque is to be designed to suit the needs of the community and is relative to time and context. The status of a building as a religious or even sacred space is actually situational. So how does digital reality will impact this? So the paper postulate that the political dimension of a mosque could be reimagined, since the digital impacts religious authority, as was previously discussed, and then it potentially reinterprets Islamic context in the digital age. At present, the mosque acts like a community center, but in the distant future, it may constitute a certain religious, sensorial attributes and experiences that impact upon a religious individual experience through the virtual. In projection, its virtual religious architectural form has the power to evoke a sense of effervescence that intensifies religious feeling, where the religious space making is part of the ritual rather than a mere container of ritual. However, arguably, the mosque form oriented toward the Kaaba which is the ontological axis of prayer for Muslim, also acts as a space that provides inward direction from the vastness of the cyberspace towards the individual. It invites present consciousness within the tangible form of space, seeking the transcendental. Although religion by definition strives for the immaterial beyond the material, which is why religious experience of prayer could be replaced through cyberspace or virtual realism. However, it ultimately needs the material to evoke the sense of the immaterial. So mosque as a space, even in any distant future, would be more relevant as people need to navigate belonging in a society that is more secularized and devoid of meaning to a religious individual. So in conclusion, the digital future, limitless potential, but the controversial reality of deconstructing traditional experience through new technological ventures such as virtual mosques may also provide chaos. Religious architecture expresses identities but also perform religious identities, both from external attachment as a representation of one's internal faith. Future theorists, however, anticipate this digital development to be technological revolution that continues to mobilize citizens to move towards a utopia of a better society through technology, and encourages participation in the construction of the utopian new world. This theoretically concludes that the mosque will inevitably be recontextualized, as all human lives would also be impacted through this evolution. Therefore, the paper concludes that designers are encouraged to participate in future discourse, to develop future mosque typology, design and curate its narrative attuned to current and future reality.